So with me this morning here, I have Price Bauer. Price is the chairman of the board of directors from UIC, and he's been working on that since 2012, and respectively been serving as the vice chairman since 2011. Alaska, which is the northernmost point in America, and your Alaska Native Corporation, UIC, provides social and economic resources to over 2,900 Inupiat shareholders and their descendants. So welcome, Mr. Bauer.
Thank you, and Paulauti, Lodak. That means good morning and welcome everybody. And I'm thankful to be up here today. It was not by choice, but I'm here, and I'm talking about the environmental and social life for what's kind of for our native people in Barrow. So, like what we were taught by our ancestors and our ancestors before us, we are the stewards of our environment up in the North Slope, and so we have to work with what we got and take only so much. So,
thank you very much. So we'll introduce the whole panel, and I'll give some introductory remarks, and then you will get the remarks worth about 5 to 10 minutes. Kristina Woolston. Kristina is the vice president for external relations with Quintillion, and Quintillion is a remarkable Arctic player with renewing and providing new connections in the future. And we had an opportunity to discuss with you a couple of weeks ago in Fairbanks in terms of potential future collaboration, and also with your colleagues in Oulu last week. And Quintillion plays a significant role in speeding up the connections, not only in the Arctic but also throughout the world. So welcome, Kristina. We have Roger Marc de Souza. You're the Director of Population, Environmental Security and Resilience at the Woolston Center. So you have a vast experience of different sorts of areas in terms of the Arctic, and I'm sure today we're going to hear your views about social issues and population issues within the Arctic. So welcome, Roger Marc. And finally, Mr. Robert Sheldon. Welcome. Robert beholds a company which does investments in the Arctic and perhaps some investments in the icebreakers in the future as well. We discussed this over the coffee this morning, so we'll see about that. But you have a vast experience of potential of investments in the future for icebreaking as well. Welcome, Robert.
Thank you.
So let me start this discussion by giving you a brief description about the Arctic Economic Council and what that is all about. So the Arctic Economic Council is a baby of the Arctic Council, and it was established when Canada was chairing the Arctic Council. And this actually was also a Russia-US effort, since the co-chairs of the working group, which was doing the preparatory work within the Arctic Council, came from both of these countries, and from Iceland and from Finland as well. So it was considered a couple of years ago that there is not enough links between the Arctic Council and the business people. So it was considered that we have politicians talking here, and we have business people talking here, and community people talking here, and there is no link into the dialogue. Yet again, most of the infrastructural work, investments, other jobs which are done in the Arctic are in the end provided by private companies. So it was considered that some sort of a tool for a dialogue between the Arctic Council and the business community is required. So this task force worked for a year and gave its recommendation of starting an Arctic Economic Council. And it gave the ideas how the construction of the Arctic Economic Council should be done, taking into account all the Arctic areas, meaning the 8 Arctic states, and also the indigenous peoples observer organizations. And now we're a team of more than 42 people working throughout the Arctic, coming from more than 40 companies, and also inviting the whole international business community into our work. Since we have now been working for 3 years, we have secured our funding, we have secured our organization, and we have established a strategy. There are certain overarching themes which give us the long-term guideline of our work. So what we don't want to see, what we have seen, at least to some extent in the work of the Arctic Council, that you have a chair period which is of 2 years, and then things sort of change when the new chair country comes in. So we don't want to work like that. So that's why we have overarching themes and a strategy. And for the overarching themes, I would like to highlight some important issues, whereas market accesses from one Arctic area to another, and also linking the international value chains of business, are of utmost importance. So we're a bit worried about the current developments of the sanctions, worried about the barriers of protectionism which have been arising throughout the past 1 or 2 years. The market entries may be somewhat more difficult than they were a couple of years ago. And this worries us because it's a fact that we need the best available services and best available products to be exported and imported from one Arctic area to another. Of high importance is also the small and medium enterprises of indigenous peoples, because they provide us the know-how, they provide us the future, and we're working on that land. So the future big enterprises are the small and medium enterprises of the day. So that's why we try to act as a voice and tone of the small and medium enterprises and of the indigenous peoples as well. Human resources capital. That is of high importance, and that is one of the flavors of the Finnish chair period for the Arctic Economic Council. So we've seen situations that the unemployment in the Arctic area is much higher than within the other areas of the specific Arctic countries. This is the case in actually most of the Arctic countries. So yet there are situations that you have to bring in people to work from the so-called southern areas to work in the Arctic areas, and simultaneously there is a high level of unemployment. So that's why the know-how of the people and education is for high importance for us. We already discussed yesterday about the rules and regulations. We need to see as united rules and regulations as possible within the Arctic. We don't want to see situations that unexpected rule changes force a company to get back from its operations. And yet again, situations where in one area you had to have these sorts of rules and another area you had to have that sort of rules is of much complication to a company which would like to operate in the Arctic areas. Interconnected Arctic, that's one of the important areas, and that's actually one of the areas for the chairmanship period of the Arctic Council for my country, Finland, as well. We will hear about the interconnected Arctic today from our colleagues who work on this area, and we discussed yesterday already about the need of cables going through the polar area, through the Northern Sea route to the Northwest Passage area. So these are some of the areas which are of high importance for the work of the Arctic Economic Council. We welcome all businesses to participate, and our first 2 or 3 years in the United States have been somewhat Alaska concentrated, I would have to say. So we really love to see the lower 48 to enter into the business and provide insights as well as provide investments, because within the Arctic there's this investment potential of $1 trillion, and within the Arctic such assets are difficult to find. We can't find $1 trillion out of the taxpayers of the Arctic people, which is only 4 million people, so we need public-private partnerships. So with this, I would like to turn to my panel and start with Price and your views about the indigenous businesses, and welcome, and the floor is yours.
All right, thank you, Tero. And like I said, Vauraste, good morning. And I'm talking about our environmental up in our area, and we have to. We were taught by our ancestors and the ancestors before us that we need to take care of our environment and just take what we need, and then make sure that there's some stuff left behind for our future generations. So we are the stewards of our environment up in the North Slope, and like I say, we have to take care of it, and then we take what we need, and then we have to make sure that everything is done properly, and then for the future, like we're dealing with the oil companies, and we got some guidelines that UIT had put together after talking with our community leaders and our Eskimo Oiling Commission that we work with that are out there protecting our sea, making sure that we continue our whaling, and they made some guidelines on how to work with the oil industry, and UIT was one of the big put input on there. They made the guidelines for the oil companies to follow. So there's some policies in place that we have already set in when Shell Oil was up there. So, but like I say, we have to take care of our environment, make sure everything is put back to the natural state when we're done, and take what we need. So, and then on the social life, we at Indigenous people, we take care of our people, and then we share what we got with our elders and people that don't have any hunters to provide food for them. We provide food for them, make sure that nobody's starving, and then our people are so close together that we work, and we got a real good social life up there. It's like we build our own hospitals for our people to go to if they're sick or something, because nobody else is doing it to help us out. So at being Indigenous people, we take care of our people and make sure that nobody's left behind, and then we have to teach our young people to follow through what we were taught and then pass it on to the next generation. So with that, I'll put an end to it, let them speak. So.
Well, thank you very much. Just a quick follow-up question. So within the indigenous communities and the indigenous people and peoples, there are actually varied views for instance, natural resources extraction. There are some views which are mainly going into the traditional livelihoods and just for the environmental protection. Yet again, there are others who are saying that we have been adapting to the change of life for centuries, and we need to adapt now and do these so-called modern investments. So we'd love to hear your view on this.
Okay, yeah, we had a lot of opposition when we first started dealing with our young people. We were taught when we were growing up, our first language was Inupiaq. So we did not speak English, so that was our secondary language that we had to learn when we went to school. If we were talking in our native language, we'd be reprimanded or whatever. But now with the younger people, it's reversed, and now everybody speaks English, and then you got to teach them how to speak Inupiaq, and then a lot of young people are more into the Western lifestyle now, so everybody's just getting so spoiled to have everything right there, and then like when we were growing up, we had to work to get what we want, and then now with Shell Oil, hopefully the oil companies are going to be coming back up North Slope. I know we got the Calais oil field, and then the Alpine, and then TD10 that over by Dead Horse, that are hopefully be providing job for our younger generation. And we got a lot of young people that are getting more educated and getting more into the uh, oil field services degrees, and a lot of young people going to college to get what they need to survive. But when we were growing up, we had to do with what we had. So.
Okay, well, thank you very much. So we'll turn over to Kristina. You're about to lay some cables. Is that the case? So what's going to be the result?
There's no about to. We have been.
That's right.
I have a couple of brief slides to just show some of
Go
the
ahead.
construction. Is that all right?
Yes.
Do you have the clicker? Are you going to run it or shall I? That'd be great. Thank you. Thank you so much, Tero, and of course the Arctic Council and the Woolston Center. So Quintillion is a company headquartered in Anchorage, Alaska. We are privately funded and are currently in the process of building our Quintillion subsea cable system. I was told that some brief slides and some pictures of what we are doing would not be unwelcomed, and that is because there is a dynamic conversation about the dynamic advancement of the Arctic. And many of the conversations are around what can we do, what should we do, what will we do. And Quintillion is here to talk about the project that we are currently constructing, and we are about complete with phase 1. The system is designed to and is planned to connect Europe to Asia. Those are natural marketplaces. There is a lack of diversity in terms of connecting those two major marketplaces and major continents. The Arctic has yet to be advanced in terms of telecommunications from a fiber route, and we took advantage of the opportunity as environmental changes and climates are adjusting. There is an opportunity with fewer days where there's ice and more open water in order to construct the cable. So we started in Alaska with phase 1. It's nearly complete. We're in service with the terrestrial system in Alaska along the Dalton Highway as of April of this year. Last summer, we nearly completed all of phase 1 Alaska, and this is a more close-up view of that system. We have a small portion of work yet to be installed this summer. Each community, each section of the project is based upon a unique risk profile, and it's important for us to accomplish and to achieve the desired burial and installation of this cable for the long-term resiliency and protection of the system. The system, as I mentioned, is anchored in Alaska, and we believe that to be the most challenging portion of the build. We have vessels currently in the water heading to Alaska to complete the last segment just off of Prudhoe Bay there to the main trunk line. And this is the beginning of a much larger system. Phase 2 is planned to head west from the Nome branching unit to Asia. That is in development right now. Phase 3A will eventually and is planned to head east from Prudhoe Bay into northern Canada with planned branching lines into northern Canadian communities, and then eventually 3B on to Europe. This will provide a diverse route. It will provide multiple points of interconnectedness out of North America, out of the United States through Alaska, and the opportunity for a shorter route between Europe and Asia and those marketplaces. While the population is often sparse and dispersed, the market has shown itself to be ready for private investment. Quintillion is a privately funded company, and we are proof, we believe, that private investment can be made in the Arctic despite some of the challenges. But the opportunities are many, and we believe the time is now for additional infrastructure investment to be made. The installation is challenging, and the environment can often be unwelcoming, but with proper planning and with a considerable amount of courage and a desire to get things done, we have been and we will continue to work in an environment that is both challenging but also provides many opportunities. There is a lack of basic equipment to install in the Arctic. There are continuing to be more resources deployed in terms of the basic tools to install in the Arctic, and we have been excited about the success that we've seen so far in terms of the installation, but it is certainly a challenge and one that we are excited to be making. These are some of the pieces of equipment, and this is off coast of Barrow last summer, Ukqiavik, pardon me, last summer as we installed our cable. The cable is designed to be buried along the cable route, and, pardon me, and that's to avoid the risk of a number of different factors. As I mentioned, each community, each landing point, all points along the route have its own unique risk profile. I see Gail Schubert in the audience here, the CEO, President and CEO of Bering Straits Native Corporation. Of course, the community of Ukqiavik and others have its own risk profile, and we have a design plan to bury the cable in order to avoid those risks and to protect the cable long term. It is important to adjust to the environment in which you are building, and it is a unique environment, but we're excited about what the future holds and the opportunities that our system will bring. The distance can be a challenge. This is a photo of a repeater, so equipment can help us overcome some of the distance and some of the challenges with latency. The communities are ready for broadband. The communities are ready for interconnectedness from what we have seen, and we are pleased to be here today to represent private industry working in the Arctic as members and Alaskans of an Arctic community to be participating in the investment of infrastructure for a sustainable Arctic. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. So it's a cable from London to Tokyo, going through the Arctic, and going also via Alaska. So for a consumer, what does this mean?
For a consumer in a variety of markets, it means a number of things. I'll start with Alaska. We were speaking with an individual in Wainwright, one of the communities in which we're deploying fiber. He had attempted to download Windows Anniversary Edition, and it took him 36 hours. It is a challenge to be a part of a global marketplace. The interconnectedness in which we are presently engaged in, but lack some of the basic tools in order to make that happen. This is an opportunity for us to truly participate in a global marketplace. The distance between Europe and Asia as two major markets is a considerable opportunity. Developing through the Arctic into northern Canadian communities that participate in telecommunications or serve through telecommunications primarily through satellite or microwave. And while we need all of the tools of telecommunications in order to connect our communities, we need backup, we need diversity, we need redundancy, and all of those things are important. This is the piece, the fiber that we are laying can provide many of the tools to advance telecommunications. For example, fiber, because of the lack of operations and maintenance costs long term, can be, and we have already seen this happening in the Alaska market, can be offered at wholesale prices at 50 to 90% cheaper than satellite and microwave backhaul prices. Quintillion is a wholesale provider. I should have mentioned that earlier. We are building the infrastructure, and we are enabling competition within communities that in many cases, over 120,000 Alaskans, have a single provider of telecommunications. You see advancement and you see innovation when you are competing and when you are working for people's products, price, and services. And so this is an exciting opportunity.
You don't have to reveal any confidential business issues, but what's the logic of the economies, and so who are your customers, and what about the investors, and so how does this all work?
The communities in which we're initially building into Alaska, and of course the long-term goal between the two marketplaces is, I think, fairly understood. In rural communities, I think it is a miscalculation that the market is not ready to serve itself from a private investment standpoint. The current telecommunications model is high margins and low volume. The capacity is limited when you're working with satellite and microwave with populations. By having a fiber backhaul, you can change the calculation and the formula to be a high volume, low margin situation. And so we feel, and we have seen, that the market is ready in demanding broadband, true broadband, and the Federal Communications Department quantifies that at 25 megabits per second download at a minimum. And these are not minimums that we're achieving in our communities. And so that is the piece. There is truly, the market is ready, and private investment takes a very strong look at that. We need to both answer the technical feasibility as well as the financial feasibility in every portion of our build, and they all stand alone.
Okay, over to you, Roger Mark. So it's the Arctic population who is going to be using this telecommunications infrastructure, I hope, quite soon. And we'd love to hear your views on environmental security issues and the population issues. So the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Tero. So I think coming out of our discussion yesterday, there were three themes that came to the fore for me, which I think the Senator also emphasized in her opening remarks. And those were around consensus, commonality, and cooperation. And I think as we think of our discussion today, I sort of go back to those themes, and I think some of the opening remarks that we've had from President Grimson about moving from the local theater to the Grand Opera House. And I think we have to be careful as we move from the local theater to the Grand Opera House that we don't lose a sense of what's happening in the day-to-day lives of the communities and people in the Arctic. So in the work that we do here at the Woolston Center on building resilience, it is very much focused on looking at some of the issues that Kristina just mentioned. I was quite pleased to hear Kristina say a number of times the risk profile, developing resiliency in a system. So you have this from a corporate operational point of view. How do you transfer these concepts and these approaches to build on the points that Price has made with regard to engaging people, communities, inclusivity, and intergenerational responsibility? So that's what we try to have a sense of how this is happening globally and what it means to the Arctic. So in terms of looking at risks in the Arctic from an environmental point of view, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has identified three potential large-scale singular events or tipping points for the Arctic. The first is looking at as light reflecting ice decreases, that an increasing amount of solar radiation is absorbed by the surface, accelerating melting and warming. So having a sense of what that means. Looking, number two, at major shrinking of the Greenland ice sheets that could significantly exacerbate global sea level rise. And third, looking at thawing permafrost and what that means in terms of the release of methane, which is 25 times more potent than carbon dioxide. So in looking at this internationally, there's a recognition that modeling these thresholds is difficult and that there's a high level of uncertainty with regard to the projections. But it is part of the risk profile and trying to have a sense of what this means for business operations and for community engagement. Part of what we also focus here on at the Woolston Center is looking at what we call backdraft impacts. So as we look at these risk profiles and put into place very good programs that address these risks, are then knock-on unanticipated impacts that we don't plan for, such as issues around conflict arising from these environmental threats and what this means for areas in Alaska and beyond in the Arctic. So there are certain key principles that we are seeing used internationally, and I think Bryce has been talking about some of them as we engage local populations and communities. So the first is around non-discrimination, equity, and equality, recognizing the importance of including these communities in the participatory processes that are involved in developing and taking action on these risk profiles. The question notion of self-determination, the importance of indigenous peoples being able to look at the right to self-governance, autonomy in matters that relate to their local and internal and local affairs, free, prior, and informed consent. What does that mean with regard to effective participation, building on the institutions that already exist within these communities, their mechanisms for representation, for decision-taking processes, and for conflict resolution. And then finally, recognizing that there's a rights-based perspective, a right and access to land, but what does this mean for development that is cognizant of their culture and identity? And how does this tie to the eco-economics of recognizing the value of preserving the cultural and ecological landscapes that we know coming out of these communities? So as we think of economic development in the region, these are some of the principles that we're looking to act upon and think about what it means for community engagement, indigenous populations, and the day-to-day lives of people in the Arctic.
In terms of identity, so if we consider the indigenous communities, they're going through a major transformation from traditional livelihoods to modern societies. Some are faster, some are slower, and it depends on the area. But what's your view about that outcome, and how do you see the societal problems linked to that?
I think it's an excellent question. I think it raises some of the questions that I think Price has also mentioned in terms of intergenerational responsibility. Part of this is a willingness and a desire to maintain traditional identity and cultures, but also move to modernism and having access to the type of resources that Kristina talks about. There's also an element of sort of the well-established elders in the community wanting to preserve these customs, and then the younger populations wanting to advance. So I think more and more globally we're seeing the importance of valuing traditional knowledge and practices and the degree to which that helps build resilience within local communities, and the importance of transferring that information and valuing that information to the younger parts of the communities in a way that they recognize that there's real economic value in looking at these bases of traditional knowledge and how that helps preserve the communities. So there's a push to modernism. We wanted to encourage that, but we also want to recognize and be respectful of the traditional knowledge and base that has served as a means of resiliency over time. And there's an international movement to recognize and build on that has been actually worked in to a lot of the international climate change agreements.
Okay, thank you very much. Robert, yesterday we heard that there is a 1 trillion investment potential, and Mark Ein said that don't worry, there are trillions. How much do you have?
Nice to meet you as well. If I may, just for a moment, it's quite an honor to be here at the Woolston Center. It's great to see our friends again from the Arctic Circle Assembly, and all of you for taking time out of your day to join us. It's also quite a pleasure to not only be on this panel along with all of us, but there's 3 Alaskans on this panel. I'm the third. I'm a newcomer, though. My descent is from Scandinavia 400 years ago, so the other 2 members have been in Alaska quite a bit longer. My family gained its start after hitting the east coast of North America. We kept going west until we hit the next ocean and then went north. We have a bit of a wanderlust about us. We pioneered most of the air routes in South America, as well as quite a bit in Alaska as well. And because of that, logistics and expertise with fuel movements and those sorts of things is part of our family businesses. We've owned hotels, grocery, all of these sorts of things. And so when it comes to investment at the high latitudes, which I operate not only in Alaska, but Canada, Iceland, Greenland, and parts of mainland Scandinavia, it has become very apparent to me that we have one overriding factor that we really have to pay attention to. The Arctic is an extraordinarily complex economic system. It may not look like that to you as viewers, However, what the best way to describe it that I've found over time is we're an emerging economy settled with a mature bureaucracy. That's a problem. In the Arctic, we have very few people, lots of resources. Bureaucracies love lots of people, lots of layers. So automatically, straight out of the chute, we have this complication of this mature bureaucracy overlay. And so when we have a normal economy where we have resource extraction, and it's important to note that that's not just fish or growing things on the ground or mining, but it's also view extraction too. Tourism came up yesterday, and I think that's part of the resource extraction sector of the economy. But the other three are value add, service and support, as well as research and development. When you have this overlay, though, of a mature bureaucracy, that can be very, very difficult to navigate. As President Grimson mentioned yesterday, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank has moved forward in a number of ways, actually also welcoming not just the Scandinavian states, but Canada as well, which is quite exciting to see that perhaps we'll have some better communication along those ways. But of course, those folks, together with the Silk Road Fund, have been very active with our friends in Russia as well. Whether it's at Yamal or some of the other potential rail and other opportunities that are emerging very rapidly, we finally see a financing mechanism that involves more than just one country or one area. We have something similar happening here in North America. The Canadian government has just launched a large infrastructure fund. You probably don't know about it, but it has 400 employees already. So when we have these sorts of mechanisms together with back in Europe, European Investment Bank efforts such as EKF, which is a Danish export credit fund, we can knit together other ways to finance things. It's kind of snuck up on us all, though. While we've all been toiling away and worrying about connectivity and how to get things put together over the last 5 years, it's really all of these items I just mentioned happened in the last 18 months. It's rather exciting to watch it move along because it allows new cross and transnational investment. So the lifeblood of all economies is finance. And now that we have these other tools in place, I think it's a very good opportunity to finally advance, perhaps normalize relations more, again with transnational investment. But the long story short is that there's a lot that has happened in the last 18 months, and I can't wait to get moving on this, perhaps even with ships.
Okay, in terms of connectivity, there are visions and dreams, and one of the visions is a tunnel between Russia and the United States. So would you be interested in investing into that?
Far more interesting is this Belt and Road Initiative that the Chinese have put together, and it's been around for quite some time. In their sphere of reference, ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, it actually makes up more than half the world's GDP. People should pay attention to it. They together with those sorts of efforts can engage in that. Of course, any tunnel to Russia or any other type of bringing the rail to the coast and then maybe having some sort of a ferrying system, more ships, you might like that better. That seems a bit more profound and likely than a tunnel at this point in time. We don't have the infrastructure on the Alaska side. The rail does not extend up. However, there is a group, the last person to build a major rail line in Canada, John Falsetta, has proposed another link. Mead Treadwell's involved with that, along with John. Mead was on or here yesterday. But so the long story short there is that tunnel no, but other ways yes.
Okay, well, investing into ships that's good.
Yes.
Yes. Or even icebreakers, perhaps. Okay, before we open the floor for the audience, some follow-up questions. Kristina, one of the overarching themes of the Arctic Economic Council is connections, connectivity, and interconnected Arctic. So we heard your views about the business your company is going to provide, but how do you see the connectivity in the Arctic in broader terms, and what are your views of that, both in terms of the investment but also for the people of the Arctic?
Mm-hmm. Well, as Robert mentioned, there are three of us that are from Alaska and participate in an economy and a social structure that is based in the Arctic. And when we look at an interconnected Arctic, and I was pleased, Tero, to be part of the Telecommunications Broadband Task Force with the Arctic Economic Council, and hopefully that will continue to be a priority. And I encourage those in the audience to go to the AEC website, Arctic Economic Council website, and you can pull up some of these work products that are profound. And I think one of the pieces of that are the participatory nations within the Arctic Economic Council and the Arctic Council and their views for telecommunications and interconnectedness. There is a lot happening, and there is a lot that nations have committed to doing, which I think is exciting. Recently in Alu, there were a number of presentations about potential plans, and I think one of the pieces that is fascinating to me, Mr. Yamamoto from Hokkaido University presented a slide about where the data centers are in the world, and there are very few in the northern climes. And there are many industries that are looking for greener pastures, so to speak, in terms of where they store their data and where are the next opportunities. Without interconnectedness in the Arctic, we would not have the opportunity to be a part of that economic potential. And that creates opportunities on the ground for our communities to participate in a global marketplace and to develop new economic opportunities. The priority to maintain our communities and our sense of place and our sense of self in our native communities is important. I think as Price had mentioned, we've adjusted over time. My family is Athabascan and from Southwest Alaska, and we've been a part of the changes over the decades and millennia, and we've adjusted to the changes, and we will continue to. And connectedness is a priority for many communities, and we think that there's great potential to preserve and to protect and to advance and to bring back many of our cultural tenets that have not been preserved and promoted for some time.
Okay. Price, the education is of high importance, and that's something you mentioned as an important area, and it's, again, one of the overarching themes of the Arctic Economic Council. Now we hear that Kristina and the colleagues are providing improved connectivity in the future. So how do you see learning by connectivity with tablets and computers and perhaps via Skype when it's very difficult to organize classroom if you have, 3 or 4 young kids only in the community? So how do you see this opportunity?
Well, our school district up in the North Slope Borough, they have the teleconference type communication that they can do with all the 8 villages that we work up there, and then our college up there does the same thing. So they can talk with UAF, and see what courses they can take or what the students can take, but to make sure that they get the right education and do the telecommunication and being with the Quintillion coming on, I think it's going to be a lot faster and a lot better connectivity to all the villages. But right now sometimes when the power is cut off like in Anchorage or Palmer, it affects our internet system up there. And then with the sunspot that we get, it really affected too. So I think with the Quintillion coming on, it's going to make some big improvements, and hopefully our colleges and the school district will improve with that too.
Okay, very good. We're going into the societal implications of an investment. So how do you see the connectivity from the sociological point of view?
No, I'm really glad to hear the discussion that we are having. Last November, we at the Woolston Center co-facilitated a meeting that was held at the University of Hawaii together with the White House, looking at representatives from Alaska, from Louisiana, and from the South Pacific. And we were looking specifically at how communities were dealing with questions on connectivity, dealing with climate risks, and their plans for relocation. So many of these communities are trying to think about, okay, how do they adapt to these risks? How do they see climate having an impact on their lives right now, and what it means for community mobilization, understanding, thinking of adaptation in place, and then thinking about what they can do before they need to relocate. And if they need to relocate, how do they plan, operationalize the relocation, and determine the cost of relocating? And this question of connectivity kept coming up. It was really important as a tool to understand some of the impacts and to think about how they could plan for that, but how they could learn from the examples from communities in Louisiana, communities in small island states in the Pacific. So there's a real urgency as these communities are on the front lines of determining how they deal with these impacts, to be able to connect not only among themselves, but to other communities and to learn from. So I think it's a huge opportunity. It's cutting edge right now, and it really is very important to be able to think about how this enables these communities to plan and take action right now.
Okay, Robert, we've already learned that you might be able to invest into ships. Would you be able to invest into Arctic connectivity?
So one of the projects that I volunteered to lend some time to earlier this year was in Alaska. We have microgrid expertise that is nowhere else found in the world. So I helped a startup get together with one of the most wealthy families in Alaska and put together their plan for commercializing microgrid technology, so that it's not just for the Arctic. This would be very useful in Africa and other places too, as well as help remove diesel from the calculus of how we power our local communities. However, there's one problem. If you don't have the expertise in the local community, and some of these communities are very small, you don't have people to sign off on certain things that you have to be stamped in order to do. And so thank goodness for Quintillion. Thank goodness for GCI, one of the sponsors here. Thank goodness for the connectivity that is coming, because without it, we wouldn't be able to successfully move forward with the funding for that small entity. And no, I have no financial interest in the company's name, 60 Hertz, by the way. You should be watching for it. But the long story short there is that they are at the forefront. They'll help deploy throughout the high latitudes, as well as probably move internationally. But it would not be possible, because one of the check and balances in that system and that business plan is to have remote sign-offs. People walk up, take a picture of the meters or whatever else needs to be monitored, and it's remotely signed off. That's literally impossible right now in most of our communities.
Okay, thank you. All right, we'll turn over to the audience and open the floor for questions. So please be brief with the questions. So with that, we allow as many as possible to participate into this, and introduce yourself, and then if you would like to address the question to certain panelists. So we'll start with Paul, please. So do we have a mic, please?
This is fascinating. President Grimson mentioned this is sort of like a hallelujah conference. I've heard things here I haven't heard in other meetings, so this is different in that sense. I'd like to go to the comments you were talking about investment and the notions that have brought up in terms of future and intergenerational. Two types of investment, equity and debt. In the debt investment, the long-term investment that would be many decades into the future, stable return on investment. How is this discussion moving in terms of engaging sovereign wealth funds and institutions to be participating in the
Sorry,
development.
can everybody hear? No? Okay, can you try to speak up a bit, or is the mic...
Okay, I was
better?
better. So the observation was that long-term debt investment in contrast to short-term equity investment. The question relates to the involvement of sovereign wealth funds and institutions in helping to transform what is considered $1 trillion of investment over the next couple decades into sustainability across the 21st century. So the question is, how do we engage the international community to invest in the sustainability of the Arctic, to take the investment that's anticipated over the next couple decades and to transform it into sustainability across the 21st century?
Okay, well, thank you. And that was Paul Bergman from Tufts. Robert.
So very, very interesting thoughts there. Because of the emergence of these entities over the last 18 months, that actually can become a reality, because it's not a return on investment that was on most people's minds before now. It was a return of investment, literally. Can you lose your entire investment and get nothing back? And that has frequently happened in various jurisdictions, including Alaska for that matter. And so with this knitting together that we have of these emerging entities that can bring us together multinationally as well as within nations for that matter too, that is facilitating a pathway for the blood to get moving, the financing to get moving. And so for, just to borrow from yesterday's example than the one earlier I used, because I want one on each side of the planet. So AIIB, Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, and then the Canadian Infrastructure Fund, they basically are acting as those conduits. They are debt heavy. The equity still has to come from somewhere else. But now, as I mentioned before, with the concern of return of investment being minimized in many of these jurisdictions, we can start talking about return on investment. I don't think there's $1 trillion of investable opportunity right now. That will come over time. That's several years out. Simply, the logistics aren't in place. Shipping has to come online. We heard yesterday that very rapidly 65% of the container traffic could move through the oceans above. The Chinese have been extremely proactive about doing that. They warned us 3.5 years ago that they were going to do it. And last fall, lo and behold, they announced that they had qualified 12 different ship types. People seemed not to take it very seriously until that announcement. So the point is things are starting to happen very, very quickly. There's a lot of investment opportunity, and there probably should be a lot of appetite with these new entities that have emerged.
Roger Mark.
Yeah, I think at the heart of your question also raises points about risk and how do we cover risk. And I would say from a community perspective, what we're hearing from communities on the front lines are questions around what is termed in climate change deliberations as loss and damage. So loss refers to those elements of infrastructure. No, damage refers to those elements of infrastructure, a bridge that may be damaged and could be repaired. Loss refers to those elements of communities, heritage, a burial ground that may be lost due to climate change impacts that cannot be rebuilt. So the question from a financial mechanism point of view is how do you cover communities' loss and damage? And this is globally, this is a really important sticking point that came up in the climate change negotiations, and the United States pushed against this because it raises questions of liability. The insurance and reinsurance industry then have been looking at these issues and say, well, how do we work with communities to help them think of how they can cover their risks, and particularly if you're dealing with communities that are risk adverse. So we have been looking at some of the innovative financial tools and mechanisms to cover loss and damage above and beyond the insurance insurance and reinsurance industry. And that involves looking at some global risk pools that we've seen in Europe, in Africa, in the Caribbean that have been successful and have had some opportunities, but also looking at what it means in terms of sovereign risk and how that helps communities deal with risk also. So it's an emerging field, but I think there's a lot of salience for those discussions in the context of the Arctic right now. So I think it's a really important question.
Thank you. And Robert?
So just to tail off of what you're just mentioning, Roger, there's some fairly new financial tools out there. There's some non-recourse lending that is now available, and it's because of the presence of these new entities that non-recourse funding will be able to be actually extended. And so these risk pools that you're referencing, this is very real. Large-scale projects can happen now, but it is the pooling of risks with some other, and I won't get into the granularity here, but some complicated financial maneuvering, but is only enabled with the emergence of these new entities. It shouldn't be lost on anyone what President Grimson took the time to share with everyone yesterday. That's very important. That is the only way, for example, gigantic projects like in the Laptev, there's just huge new oil discovery a few days ago that was announced. Gigantic projects like that wouldn't otherwise be funded multinationally without these conduits.
Okay, gentleman in the fifth row, please.
Yes, thank you. Question for Ms. Woolston. With regards to...
Could you introduce yourself, please?
Oh, yes, Steve Keating from Georgetown Institute for the Study of Diplomacy.
Thank you.
I worked on cable ships up in the polar areas 30-plus years ago, and it's really exciting to see these new cable lines being installed. Did Quintillion do new surveys for these cable routes? And considering how little new charting is done, is Quintillion considering sharing that data with the hydrographic services of Canada and Alaska so that updated charts could be constructed?
Hi, Steve. Thank you. Great question. So the answers are yes. The Quintillion's project, we spent about 2 years doing geotechnical and geophysical surveying and mapping, understanding the exact topography and the makeup of the seafloor in which we are trenching was very important to us because we needed to select the correct tools. Burying the cable along the route is important because of the many different risks that occur, including ice scouring, making sure that we achieve the desired burial depth, which goes below any historical ice scouring. So one of the things that we learned is we could see all of the historical ice gouging. So when the ice breaks up in the spring, it's a little bit like a mixing bowl, particularly off of Ukhiavik and Iliktuk Point in Prudhoe Bay, and breaks up and pushes on each other and gouges the seafloor. So we could see all of the historical gouging. We just couldn't tell if it was 10,000 years old or 10 years old. That required some additional research, which wouldn't necessarily add to the design of the build. So we designed the installation to go deeper than anything we saw. And so that's what the desired burial plan is for our system. When it comes to the information that we have gained, and you're correct, these particular areas have not been mapped or surveyed in many cases, and we have turned over that research, the metadata, and to NOAA, and they're compiling that. We are, the next phases of the system, phase 2, as I mentioned, is in development. Those all require mapping and surveying as well, and so certainly we see an international collaboration opportunity. Of course, we have to balance that with the proprietary, pieces of being a company that's doing this for the first time. Thanks.
Okay, thank you much. And lady in the second row, please.
Hi, my name is Jessica Shadian. I'm from the CIC and the Bill Graham Center at University of Toronto. And perhaps my question, I don't know, goes to Robert. And I'm wondering if you know, because you're talking about these different kinds of schemes, if you know anything about the International Finance Corporation, and they have this new, it's called a Managed Co-Lending Portfolio Program, and it's for emerging markets.
Can you please put the mic quite close?
It's for
emerging
markets and developing markets, and the whole point is to focus on infrastructure development and kind of the exact things we're talking about in the Arctic. And from what I'm seeing from this, it's really focused on states, and so emerging economies in the context of the state. And I'm wondering if if you know anything about this particular program, and if it's possible to kind of see the art, like looking at a regional perspective. And so even though we have, most of the Arctic states are not emerging economies, but the northern parts of those economies are very much similar to emerging economies. And if there's any, possibility for Arctic to think transnationally and to be able to tap into something along these lines.
So yes and no. The difficulty with opportunities such as that is if you're part of a mature national government, you're not going to gain access, as I understand, to those programs. However, the good news is, so I'm involved with the front-end financial structuring of 4 different new international airports in the high latitudes. There are other programs that are available, and there's very unique programs available as well. And so while it's great to see other folks come alongside, I really think that from the debt side of things, which is where I primarily operate, that there is plenty of capital available now. We just need to focus it properly.
Okay, gentleman on the 5th row, please.
Thank you. I'm Joe Demento, Professor of Law at UC Irvine, and I'm just going to add to the complexity of the environment of investment by underscoring some new understandings of liability within the context of domestic and international law that are being informed in part by the increased scientific ability to identify sources of greenhouse gases and direct them to specific impacts and damages. So it's another part of the complexity of knowing when and where to invest. We're going to be exploring this at our next Arctic program in October at the university.
Okay, thank you. I think it was more a comment than a question. Any of the panelists? No specific views. Okay, we'll move on. Please, gentlemen on the 5th row.
Good morning. Thank you for the opportunity to be here. My name is Michael Castellini. I'm the Vice President for the University of the Arctic for academic programs. And the last 2 days have been fascinating, as Paul Berkman mentioned. There's lots of things we never have heard before. It's been great. But one of the things is a huge demand for the interconnection, the education components, and the ability for the universities in the Arctic to be able to talk to each other, to talk to the southern parts of the world, and to be able to move students back and forth, move education programs back and forth. We are also not major investors. Most of the time, of course, we're trying to scrounge money as we can to keep ourselves going. So we don't have the ability, the universities, to invest, as we've been talking about here, in this type of infrastructure, but a massive demand for it. And so my question is, looking at it from all of your perspectives, is the role that the universities can do in both directions, either in helping you achieve your goals, either through discussions like we just heard from UC Irvine here, or the other direction, helping us achieve our goals, because we're usually trying to do this on a shoestring budget. And I don't know how to work in the area of economic investment from universities' perspective, because we have the demand, but not necessarily the ability to invest heavily, nor the ability to create, in many of the cases, the businesses, although there are business centers, obviously, at universities around the north. So I don't know how to actually present the question, except from the perspective of, we have a huge demand, how can we help, or how can you help us?
Okay, let's take brief comments from each of the panelists, since it's a broad and complicated question. But perhaps we would move towards public-private partnership thinking in your problem. So start with Robert and go along. Robert.
So right now we have a program that we've launched in subnational Canadian government. And pardon me for not giving many names here. I'm under all sorts of NDAs. So we have a public-private partnership with a Canadian subnational that it's very productive for everybody. It ties together research. It ties together adventure tourism at the mid and high level. We're not looking at the low end of the cruise ships. It's mid and high level. And then in addition to that, traditional knowledge. When you knit all those together, and existed already at a place. There are services that mid and high level adventure tourists are willing to pay for. And that actually is creating a cash flow for the research organizations that are there. So imagine, if you will, those few dollars that are allocated to you. Not only does it get you there, it actually creates a new revenue stream for you. And that's what we've been able to put together over the last 8 months.
Roger-Marc?
I'll just say quickly, so I serve on an advisory board for the National Science Foundation, and we're specifically looking at how we can bridge the gap between social science and natural science. And we're doing this in the context of looking at how we build resilient communities. And in doing that, we very often talk about the importance of citizen science, engaging universities, bridging across silos, and what it means for basic research. And the Arctic is really a key component of the discussions and deliberations. So I would say look to what's happening and what's coming out of the National Science Foundation. We continue to push for research across disciplines, and the Arctic comes up all the time when we meet.
Kristina?
Great question, and I'll approach it a little differently than Robert as a developer of infrastructure, and you as a user group are important to those of us developing the infrastructure. You represent large potential in terms of users on our network or others' networks and in communities, and that's part of the market analysis and where do we consider building and what's a what are communities that have the potential to really use the broadband and to grow that use. The diversity of the usership is important, and the research community is significant. BARC, the Barrow Arctic Research Center, is a significant player in the Arctic in terms of research facilities, and there's great demand for increased connectivity and capacity in those communities with institutions such as BARC, with the schools, the Ilisavik, the local college, the University of Alaska. Facilities that do research are contributing to the opportunities to us to develop these systems. For example, the University of Alaska system has a research facility that's looking at Arctic installations of infrastructure, and that applies to telecommunications as well. And so I think from a participatory standpoint as an investor, I think there are other ways that the educational system is making investments that make it possible for companies like Quintillion to invest.
Press?
Okay, on the like what Christine said, we got the Ilisavik College, and then they go out and apply for grants to get what they want, and then I don't know how they divide it out to the different villages to improve their learning pockets, and then the Barrow Science Foundation, like what Christine said, fall into the National Science Foundation, and then they apply for grants and stuff like that, and then they continue to work up there and hopefully do more research and get more things done up there. So.
Okay, thank you. The final question, yes, the lady in the back row, please.
Hi, Allison Azar. I work for the U.S. Maritime Administration. I have a question for Kristina and possibly also Price, if you want to weigh in on it. For your development of the fiber optic cable and then also the operation and maintenance that comes with that going forward, how are you managing those operations, and what kind of agreements do you have with the local communities for conflict avoidance? How are you working with them, and how are you going to move forward with that in the future?
Thank you. That's a great question. As Alaskans, it's important to us to have a healthy and vibrant conversation and to rely on local knowledge first and foremost in the communities in which we are developing. And also we have, it's taken us years to achieve the permits and the agreements and the rights of ways and the approvals in order for us to move forward with construction and installation, over 275 of them. And so it's been an active process. And since we are the first company to be deploying subsea cable off the coast of the Arctic United States and Alaska specifically, it comes with the unique opportunity of being the first. And so that has been another not necessarily challenge, but it's been it's the reality of working in the Arctic and working with the co-management groups, the Alaska Eskimo Whaling Commission, the Barrow Whaling Captains Association, COERIC out of Nome, the local co-management groups, and we participate with an incidental harassment authorization. I mentioned earlier our vessels are currently on their way to Alaska. Under our incidental harassment authorization, we have two protected species observers on the vessels in order to maintain an appropriate distance from migratory mammals. And we coordinate on a daily basis with the whaling captains and the communities about where our vessels are and what they're doing. They move very slowly. It's basically a half a knot, and in many cases, the vessels are stationary, and so there's not a tremendous amount of movement or activity. But we do coordinate quite closely with them. And then, in terms of the operations and maintenance, and from a fiber standpoint, the initial investment for construction and installation is more upfront, but the long-term benefit is that the operations and maintenance should be quite minimal. We have dual redundancy of our equipment in each of the cable landing communities, and I can speak for Alaska because we've already installed those. The design going forward is yet to be determined, but we have local operations and maintenance agreements with the local telecommunications providers. For example, ASTAC, which is the Arctic Slope Telephone Association Cooperative based out of Utqiagvik and in Point Hope and Wainwright, and then OTZ out of Kotzebue and Telalaska out of Nome. And so it's been an active participation with each of these communities and their local providers in order to train and to prepare everyone for the welcoming of fiber. And I will say one of the neat things that has happened, Aztec in particular has deployed fiber to every home and building in the communities of Point Hope and Wainwright. And I believe that they're working in Utqiagvik to advance that as well. So an incredible amount of local participation and partnership as fiber is installed and is scheduled to be in service December 1st into those coastal northwestern and northern and northwestern Alaska communities.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Before allowing the panel to give their final 1 or 2 minute elevator speech, I would like to tell you an Arctic elevator speech. And this happened in St. Petersburg 2 or 3 months ago when we were visiting with the AEC Governance Committee, the Arctic and the Antarctic Research Institute of Russia. And the team went to the elevator and we were supposed to go from the 2nd floor to the 9th floor. And the button for the 9th floor was pushed and the elevator started to go downwards. So we had sort of interesting times and it went down and stopped like this and the doors didn't open. So here was the Arctic Economic Council Governance Committee with the director of the Arctic and the Antarctic Research Institute in the elevator. So what happened was that we were immediately given a presentation on the Arctic and the Antarctic Research Institutes. That's the best elevator speech I've ever had. And this happened in St. Petersburg. Yes. So the final remarks in terms of what we've discussed and in terms of the Arctic Investment Protocol. So the Arctic Economic Council is in a process of adapting the Arctic Investment Protocol where there are 6 important overarching themes, and this is provided by the World Economic Forum. The first one is to build resilient societies through economic development. The second one is to respect and include local communities and indigenous peoples. Third one is pursue measures to protect the environment of the Arctic. Fourth one is to practice responsible and transparent business methods. Fifth one, consult and integrate science and traditional ecological knowledge. And finally, strengthen Pan-Arctic collaboration and sharing of best practices, which I think that this all has been about. So the final concluding remarks with each of the panelists. Start with Price, please.
Okay, for the economic development, we seek to improve the well-being of our quality of life for our community by creating or retaining jobs and support the growth of our income, and then hopefully we'll get our people to get some jobs so because we need jobs in the North Slope because all the big infrastructure that we have up there are completed, and with the oil field coming on, hopefully we'll be improving the community on the North Slope from Barrow to Nueksuk to Kaktovik and to Wainwright and Atkasuk. So we're hoping that what we hear is what's going to happen. So,
Thank you, Kristina.
Thank you. Well, as my husband would say, I need a tall building for my elevator speech because I have a lot of words, and I've used a lot of them already today. But
Well, in St. Petersburg, it was 10 minutes, and then the doors opened.
praying for a elevator failure.
Yeah.
Temporary. As I began my talk today, it's around this dynamic Arctic environment and the opportunities and taking advantage of them and timing. And in Aulu recently, there were a number of presentations around additional telecommunications projects that are in the planning stages, not yet in construction or development phases. But there's an opportunity in the Northeast, the Northwest Passages, the lower Northwest Passage, where Quintillion is planning to lay its cable. And the opportunity to be active nations in the advancement and the planning of this is important. And it is I think encouraging that the focus of the events this week around Russia-Arctic collaboration and from an Arctic collaboration standpoint, the United States has, I think, an opportunity and would be well positioning itself to be more engaged and more active in the Arctic role and what that means from a national security standpoint, from a development standpoint, from a research standpoint. So I think there's a great deal of opportunity, and we're thrilled to be part of the conversation.
Thank you, Rajumak.
Thank you. I'd say 3 quick points. First, I think throughout our discussion today, we've talked about the opportunity to learn from traditional practices, from communities, to learn how we can cooperate with Indigenous groups, and to think about what this means for win-win economic development that helps build networks of resilience that float all boats. So there's a really unique moment in time right now, and I think the framing that you have articulated corresponds quite well to that. The second point is the one that I raised around ecoeconomics, to understand the short and long-term economic value of supporting ecological and cultural landscapes, and to understand the interactions with the local communities so we avoid these kind of backdraft environmental conflicts that we see can potentially emerge. So how can we do that? And finally, this framing that's important, the importance of recognizing how do we look at the day-to-day lives of these communities. What we are hearing from communities in terms of relocation plans is important, but ultimately that is tied to community livelihoods and well-being. So how do we take that into account as we move forward with long-term, resilient economic development for these communities?
Thank you, Robert.
Well, the polar giants have been joined by a new one that's been practicing for the last 10 years in the Antarctic. It's been lost on some. China has emerged. They have expertise in all sorts of things. Someone asked a bit ago about having access to subsea data and those sorts of things. China has named over 200 sites in Antarctica. They've been practicing and honing their skills for mapping and those sorts of things. So they're a serious contender both in terms of capital as well as experience, and it's gone unnoticed by many. But they're a welcome new polar giant that has come to join us. However, as I mentioned before, we have challenges with this emerging economy, mature bureaucracy conundrum. And so if there's any involvement at all that I can recommend, it's that with local stakeholders, such as some at this table, such as some that spoke yesterday. Without that local stakeholder involvement and engagement, It'll be very difficult to overcome things. Another problem that we have in the high latitudes is that the projects that are moving forward, a lot of them are pet projects. And that is a problem. We need to go and look at the projects that are naturally moving forward, the ones that are ready, the ones that people are asking to fund. It's great to have new ideas out there. It's great to address some of those things. But there's a siloing that has also happened because of this disconnect, this conundrum I mentioned. And so it's through concentrated efforts in looking at what is possible now, maybe not $1 trillion, but there are projects right now that should be funded and have good returns. It's doing that hand in hand with the local stakeholders is how we advance.
Okay, well, thank you very much, everybody, for joining us. Thanks to the audience, and let's give a big hand to the Wilson Center and to the panel. Thank you.